Hey everyone, I'm Mary Beth McAndrews from Dread Central, and I am here today with Seth A. Smith, the director of Tin Can. How are you?
How you doing? Yeah, I'm doing great. Nice to be here. Thanks.
I'm excited to chat with you about this movie. And my first question is pretty basic, but where did the idea for Tin Can come from for you?
Well, it's a bit dark, but I was thinking about factory farming and
Oh,
it's a very, it's a lot of animal cruelty, of course. There's a lot of horrific stuff going on, and I thought it would be interesting, to see that scenario played out with humans in place of animals. So that was one part. And my co-writer and I, we had always been talking about doing something in a very small space, to keep things cheap, but also, playing with space and dimension and, so we landed on this kind of prison movie idea and a dungeon film, and after a while, the movie just told us what it wanted to be. So
cool. And I have to ask, of course, was this kind of conceived before the pandemic or after the pandemic?
yeah, that it was before, and it's been the pandemic actually kind of has made this stretch this thing out. So yeah, it was very interesting. We shot the things. We're kind of in over a month and a couple months, and we had all the pre-production. So we're living this kind of fantasy pandemic, and then as we were finishing editing, then the real thing happened, and it was like no.
That's
But but it has been interesting, right? It's like I think at first, the perceptions changed a little with the movie. We didn't get to do our film festival releases in person, which was a bummer. But and then, right off the bat, people are like, "Oh, I don't want to hear about the pandemic in film right now." But as we progressed, and the pandemic's changed, it's been interesting to see how the meaning of the films changed a bit.
yeah.
As we're going from, in quarantine, talking to people through devices and not seeing anyone, to now we're kind of living with this thing that's forever stalking us, and there's not much we can do about it, but just go on.
That's got to be so weird to like make this pandemic movie and have all of this rhetoric that we're now so used to, like quarantining and like, is there going to be
Yeah,
a vaccine? Like watching the beginning, I was like, what? Like this is it. Just it felt so relevant to what I feel
yeah,
like we hear now, which is so sad that a sci-fi movie is so close to our our
I know.
experiences
It's
now.
weird.
This
Yeah,
is so bizarre.
yeah. It's strange. I guess I didn't expect to be fact checked as much.
You're like, there will be another pandemic. It's fine. It's fine. But you talk about filming in small spaces, and obviously a lot of this movie takes place in a very confined space. What were like, how did you guys film with this tin can setting? Obviously there's other sequences going on outside of it, but especially with this claustrophobia and this use of space, like how what were the kind of the process for filming these sequences when it's just her inside of the can chamber thing?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we didn't have a huge budget, but we definitely, we're thinking we have to make a few of these things because they all had different gags. There was a couple that we had to fill with water. There's one with water, and there's one we had to a few we had to spin around, and a lot of times, we have to shoot around the whole can. So we had to have this special can where each section of it could come off. There were like, I think, 16 sections in all or something. So yeah, it was interesting. Some shots it was, there'd be like 10 of us moving pieces out of place and in place as the camera's moving around. And interesting, new for me. I hadn't dealt with that before, but luckily we had a really good production designer, Matt Likely, who is game for all the stuff we had to do, and we had a really great actress, Anna Hopkins, who just like I was just like blown away with how she dealt with everything, and how game she was for everything. It's not the type of role you pitch to someone, and they're going to be like, oh, that sounds great. It's tough.
For sure. And I was going to ask about her performance because I've seen her in a couple other sci-fi things, and she really is such a star in this movie because a lot of the camera is just on her face and it's reliant on her, and it is such a challenge. So I was curious what it was like working with her in such a film.
Yeah, she was terrific. Like, I mean, I could tell early on when we were, discussing the film before she signed on that this was the way to go. Is she should be the person to do this.
Cool.
She brought a very interesting, personality to the character that was a little different than I pictured, but I was really into it, and she also had just incredible, sense of humor about the whole thing. It was ridiculous, there'd be these. All we had There's so much slime in this movie, and there'd always and tubes, and there'd always be these like fart sounds all the time, and she'd just keep a straight face until she couldn't hold it any longer. Yeah.
I always love hearing about that on sets for horror movies because I always feel like horror movies just have like the happiest, like the like giggliest crews, and like it's such a serious movie, but then
Yeah.
afterward everyone is just laughing at all of the ridiculousness going on around
I should say I'm always the one to blow the takes by laughing. Yeah, it's always me. I can't keep a straight face. I actually have to turn away from the actors.
Don't look at me. But so you mentioned the production design, and I mean, this film has such an incredible aesthetic, and it feels both retro and futuristic at the same time. And you
Cool.
said Matt Likely is your production designer. So how did the two of you kind of collaborate and create this futuristic, retro-y sci-fi aesthetic for Tin Can?
I had a lot of napkin drawings, and he was able to decipher them. There are a lot of sci-fi movies. They're just really, yeah, flashy. They have a lot of tech and gadgets and screens, and I want to do the opposite of that. And so I was looking at medieval films, because I like the aesthetic. Kind of, so I was kind of imagining this primitive future, and so yeah, we had some restrictions with the budget, and we knew we can only, make this many things. And but yeah, Matt, he's incredible. He worked on The Lighthouse as an art director, and I
Oh,
believe,
cool.
and yeah, and actually that's we used the same space that they filmed in, so he was very familiar with, that place for building stuff, and
Yeah.
yeah, we were able to, come up with some cool sets.
Were there any like particular movies that were kind of in the back of your head, or that you could kind of you drew any kind of inspiration from for Tin Can?
I watched a few like Man in a Box kind of films. Like I watched a bit Buried, and Lock was one that came out kind of
Uh-huh.
recently at that time, which was kind of cool because if you're in a single space, you want to kind of make it interesting because it's hard. There's
Yeah.
not a whole lot of that you can shoot within a 3 by 5 space. I looked at Kill Bill, just how they did, from a practical sense, how they shot things.
Yeah.
But as far as I wasn't looking at anything specific. I was more looking at old medieval films like Seventh Seal and things like that.
Oh, cool. I'd love to hear more about how Seven Seal, like what you use from like how you looked at Seven Seal and linking that
Well,
Tin Can.
it was more the medieval aesthetic I
Yeah.
was kind of drawn to. And I kind of wish we're seeing there's a lot of actual devices in this movie, but I was kind of seeing them more as, how torture devices might be in that era, like
I was
that
thinking torture devices a little
yeah,
bit watching this movie.
there's a lot of gears and things, rather than, someone touching a computer screen. And it was something that me and my costume designer Sarah Hayden Roy were kind of excited about, like hoods and looking at executioners and just yeah. I mean, it's if someone watches the film, they're not going to say, "Oh, this is a medieval film," but it was definitely kind of in our minds. That was kind of what we're thinking about.
Cool. And then the design for like the body horror aspects of this film as well. I would love to hear about the kind of conceiving around that. And I mean, even at like the time you see the first glimpse of when she's peeling those things out of his skin,
Oh
like
yeah.
how did you kind of think about what that would look like and where and why, like what you wanted to achieve with what that kind of disease looked like?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I had been playing around with slime mold. I'm kind of fascinated by slime mold. It's like this organism that's it's a lot different than anything else. I think, that was, I thought part of it, like, this would be make a very interesting disease, if slime mold kind of took over the earth. But
So is slime
I,
mold exactly what it sounds like? Mold slime?
I think it's kind of classified as a fungus, maybe, but
A
yeah,
fungus. Okay.
yeah. I mean, I'm definitely not the person to describe what it is exactly, but yeah, it's like kind of a colonial structure of like, I don't know, enzymes or something, and it just keeps multiplying and growing. That's probably totally wrong, but it's very interesting to watch because if you actually a lot of the footage of the coral in the movie is actually just me in my basement using an old microscope with my
No
slime mold.
way.
And you don't really
Cool.
see much movement, but if you speed it up, you actually see this crazy movement that's just kind of has been invisible to you, and it's very interesting. It's just on a slower level. And
Cool.
my co-writer was drinking a lot of lion's mane tea, like this mushroom tea. And if you look up lion's mane, it looks kind of like coral. It's like it has that kind of weird coral kind of leafy look.
Oh, it does. I
So
had to look it up
yeah,
while we're talking.
okay, cool, yeah. So I think some of that, that was some of the direction, and yeah, we had
Oh,
a really
cool.
cool. Prosthetic creature designer, Alan Cook, and he was, I'm a visual artist, so I draw all this stuff first, and yeah, he was able to. It was incredible, like how close it came to the drawings. I was just very impressed, and our other makeup, our key makeup, Kyle and Nicole, just took it to a totally different level, and yeah, it worked out really well, actually.
Amazing. And so are you a horror fan? Like did you grow up a horror fan, or like when did kind of horror movies, sci-fi movies come into your life?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I am a horror fan. I mean, I kind of like I love horror deeply, but I also kind of hate some horror too. Like it's kind of like this. It's like a balancing act for me. But
Yeah.
yeah, I grew up watching VHS films at a my convenience store in a small town had
Oh yeah.
a selection of B movies and Cronenberg films, and they let me rent them when I wasn't old enough, and I just rewatched them over and over again. So yeah, B movie and horror has always been, a love of mine. I would make like short films as a kid with my dog, and I was like, I didn't, I actually only became a filmmaker, well, fairly recently, but I haven't spent my life doing it, and it's been nice. Horror is the genre I find is pretty well the most experimental genre in film, where you can
Oh
just
yeah.
take a lot of risks. You can play around. Things don't have to be super realistic. I'm actually tired of realistic movies, so it's perfect for me. It's so I don't think I like exploring different corners of horror in sci-fi and genre. So I
Cool.
feel like I'll be working in genre forever, but I try to do different things every time.
Cool. And so if you could pick maybe one of your favorites, I know that's hard because favorite, but a movie that's had like a horror movie that's had a big influence on you or has stuck with you for a long time, what would that be?
Yeah, yeah, that is hard. I think just because recently I was talking about this, but this movie I was talking about this movie, but The Fly is something that sticks out because I watched it when I was young, and it was I liked
How old were you
seeing.
when you watched it for the first time?
God, I can't remember. I feel like I was 12 maybe or something.
Oh wow.
Um, and yeah, it was just cool. You just saw the main character was a monster, and that doesn't usually happen. And it was also there was a lot. It kind of leaves you thinking a lot. There's a lot of questions, and I really like horror movies that have they're more than just the surface level slasher. There's like a lot
Yeah.
going on to kind of unpack.
It's also one of the saddest romance movies. I always call it one of the saddest love stories I've ever
Exactly.
seen too. It
Yeah.
is.
I
Yeah.
mean, there's some similarities to this movie. I wasn't
Yeah.
thinking ahead, but now that I was talking about The Fly recently, and in hindsight, I'm like, yeah, there's pods, and there is this sad love story. It's like, yeah, so it definitely is in there.
That's amazing. And so my final question for you then is, if you could schedule your perfect double feature with Tin Can, what movie would you pair with it? And it can't be The Fly, since we just talked about The
Oh,
Fly.
okay, double feature. Yeah, I ran this briefly this genre film festival in Atlantic, Canada called Outlier, and
Ooh, cool.
we had the film The Visitor, and
Oh
and
yeah.
it was a really weird film, and I really enjoyed it, and I was a little inspired by that movie too, so maybe that movie. I'd like to see it again.
That's so cool, for sure. I need to revisit that movie too.
Yeah,
Um, well, thank you so much for joining me today to chat about Tin Can.
cool. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.